All right, ladies and gentlemen, let's start working our way toward our seats, please. I would ask you, as we're doing this, to turn off the ringer of your cell phone unless you have a really cool ringtone, whereupon I'll ask you to have it go off a number of times just for our own edification. But I'm looking out at the crowd, and I don't think there are any really cool ringtones out there.
Wow.
Do you want, Bill, do you want Mitch Miller or something like that?
That would be really cool. We have one other small wrinkle this morning. Your budding TV careers have been put on hold for the time being, in that the webcast is down. You all look aghast. The webcast is down in the entire building, so God only knows what the people out there are going to do for content this morning. But having said that, I think we're certainly working to bring it back up, and just so as you know. Anyway, that I stalled for long enough to get Tim in the room, and I guess we can then start. Radhika, it's all yours, please, for the ground rules.
Thank you, Bill. Good morning, everybody. I am Radhika again, here with you to help you. And the good thing is that none of my information has changed. The bathrooms are still where they were last night. The exits are still the same, and the cafe is still downstairs. So if you need any attention, any help, either or, then I can help you. If you didn't see where the bathrooms were yesterday, I can walk. We didn't show you where they are. But for people who are not here, let me just let you, the bathrooms are out the door on the left, past the Byron Scherer Auditorium. Fire exits, one behind me, two up there, and cafe is still on the first floor. One important thing, we do not have a public comment period today, so we won't be accepting any public comments from the public. And the webcast viewers, as Bill said, they're missing in action for us right now. I'll keep Bill posted, updated. Whenever I hear that the webcast is up, I'll let Bill know. Other than that, everything is nice. One more thing. There will be a break, and then Bagley-Keene requirements still apply today as well. So please keep that in mind. And I'll
Thank you, Radhika. I want to point out we have one substitution this morning, in that Todd Delaney is here this morning, and we've had a couple of members leave over the course of the evening, but it's substantially the same crowd. Debbie, you have some comments?
Thank you, Chair. Good morning, everyone. It's nice to see all of you back, and I just want to say that yesterday's discussion was incredibly helpful and fascinating. When Odette and I sat back and said, okay, what are the questions that we really want to address with the panel? Of course, we came up with a whole myriad of them, and so we discussed with the co-chairs, well, if we have to limit it to 3, what would it be? And so we selected things where we had some angst, we had some question about it. We felt like we had done the best we could, but wanted to hear a little bit more particular feedback. And in fact, we got that wonderfully yesterday. So thank you. It's hard not to just want to run back and start debating and talking about these things. So thank you again for that incredibly helpful comments. This morning is of particular interest because this part of the regs is truly new in the sense that we have a real challenge ahead of us, that intersection between practical and meaningful. And it's a tough one. And so I'm very much looking forward to your thoughts on how did we do and where we can move forward. And I'm going to let Bill frame the issue a little bit more. I just wanted to express my gratitude for your dedication. And at the end, we'll circle back when we talk about next steps.
Thank you, Director. I would point out to you that in your sheet that you received yesterday, questions for discussion, the question for this first period of time up until approximately 10 o'clock is the following question. The decision was made to ensure quality for the AAs through 1, DTSC audits, and 2, creating a certification program for assessors, and 3, posting non-redacted portions of the AAs on DTSC's website for public review. Given DTSC's limited resources, is this approach sufficient to provide meaningful quality assurance? And what steps could we take to restructure or supplement this approach? So I guess what it comes down to at this point is points that you would care to make about alternatives assessment and particularly the process of generating them, shaping them up, and dealing with the data are most in bounds for this first this first session. Although, in general, if there are things that you want to contribute about AAs in this session, please feel free to do so. Now, while you're thinking about that, and while I'm waiting to see people's tent cards go up, I'll also point out that after the break we have, thank you, Ken, we have one more session, and that will be a general session. There are a number of things about the draft discussion regulations that we didn't have a chance to discuss yesterday. And so in that last hour and a half, those things are in bounds. I would ask you to consider not just things that weren't touched, and I have a couple of them myself, but also any integrative sort of remarks that you would care to make about the entire process. Those are in bounds as well. All right, very good. Thank you. We have at least a bit of demand for the floor, and I'll take them in the order that I saw them. Ken, you're first, then Mike Wilson and Julia.
Good morning, everybody. And this is kind of a ringer because Bill and I sort of said, well, I have enough concern about this area that I'll just pick it up right away and get us started. When I reviewed the draft as it's presented now, I was very pleased with most features of it. I had comments which I sent to Debbie and the staff. But my greatest concern focused on this question about, or the issue about the way in which the alternative assessment quality would be assured by the use of outside staff from firms and from consulting firms, et cetera. And I've had a reasonable amount of experience with this line of program because of the toxic use reduction program uses a form of this kind of idea, which is sort of exporting or contracting out a certain kind of part of the law to a private operation and trying to regulate and manage that operation in a way that both benefits the firms and the folks that are really trying to, in this case, do alternatives assessment, but in our case do what are known as toxic use reduction plans. But on the other hand, make sure that that there's good quality control and that the agencies that run the program in Massachusetts learn from what is going on and become more sophisticated in their own activity as they move along with the increasing knowledge that has been built up over the years of how to, in our case, substitute or reduce the use of specific toxics in production operations. We today have in Massachusetts it's obviously a much smaller state, much smaller routine. We have about 550 reporting entities. We have licensed about 230 what are called toxic use reduction planners. They used to be called, by the way, TERPs, but they all hated that term. So, and for those of you in the medical community, you may know that stands for something else. So, but they are very much a part of the program. The way you become a toxic use reduction planner is you go to a training program which is run by the Institute. It's a reasonably long training program, and I mean it used to last about 10 weeks. It lasts about 5.5 weeks, I think, at this point. You then sit for an exam, which is provided by the state, and then once you are licensed or certified, you need to accumulate a certain amount of continuing education credits and to be relicensed every 2 years. And one of the easiest ways to get those credits is to come to the annual conference of the toxic use reduction planners, where there are a whole series of workshops which they can take to advance their knowledge, and also gives us, the people who run the program, the chance to really meet with them, learn from them, hear what's going well, hear what's not going well, learn about new technologies, and all of the kind of general learning that has really built the program into being a sophisticated program. Now that can't be translated directly into California. California is much larger. It's really, planning is one thing, alternatives assessments are another thing. The department, the department doesn't have the resources that we have, even in a relative way, for managing the program, because we actually have a fee structure that actually supports the program, and this legislation did not provide a fee structure. So, the department is much more constrained. But I will say a couple of things about what I am concerned about with the plan that has been put forward in this version, and also make some recommendations of what I think can be done within this context. I am concerned that there's going to be too many accrediting bodies, and that they're going to be accrediting a lot of assessors who are doing wildly different things. They're going to get trained, obviously, by these accrediting bodies, but the department has little to say about that training. They're actually going to be certified by the accrediting body, not by the state. They will be doing their work, and the way in which the regulation at the moment sets up very good qualifications for both the accrediting body and the assessors, which I would call input kind of criteria, but no output criteria. That is, to really examine whether an accrediting body is actually performing its function well, or that the assessors are performing their functions well. There's no way to have accountability back other than the checking of the alternatives assessment. And the alternatives assessment, maybe there's going to be a few. I think there's going to be a lot, which means the department is going to be not only dealing with the responsibility in a short window of time of basically approving or disapproving a large number of alternative assessments, but also really trying to deal with the variable quality and in a situation of having to reject a bunch because they didn't meet the standard, and then trying to deal with the rejections and learn why. Was it because the accrediting body wasn't doing the proper training? Was it because it's just the distance between the department's obligation to run a sophisticated program and the actual work of doing the alternatives assessment is so long, the arm is so long, that I'm fearful that it's going to be very burdensome, and there's going to be a lot of embarrassment in the sense of firms getting their alternatives assessment rejected when they thought they were doing the right thing, and I'm just really concerned. This is a weakness in our program. And I can say a few other things. There's, of course, the idea that the alternatives assessment will be put up on the web with redacted parts for the confidential business information. There's one way to check quality. But I'm concerned about that because either some firms are going to redact everything, and it's going to be really embarrassing and all, or there's just going to be an unwillingness to really make the alternatives assessment very sophisticated because people know it's all going to be revealed. So the incentive is to not say very much because who knows what somebody's going to say. The audits, I think, are a good idea, but for a well-funded agency. I'm worried that of the things an agency strapped for resources would cut is audits. It would be the thing you would most likely think about. So I'm worried. I think we need a different approach here. So let me suggest a couple of ideas. First of all, let me just say I'm not a fan of the third-party certification that was in the earlier version. I think this version could work with a few minor adjustments, or a few adjustments I would suggest. One is, I think that the number of accrediting bodies should be limited, like maybe 4 or something like that, and have people compete for the right to be an accrediting body for the state. But that would create a more cohesive group of accrediting bodies so that the department can work with them to really make sure that everybody's in alignment. Secondly, clearly accrediting bodies are going to charge fees to do the training and to do the certification. I know this is not in the law, but should any of that be passed back to the agency, such that the agency actually has some revenue off of this to actually be able to do anything with it? There's very few places where there's any revenue generating capacity. But somebody's going to make money off of this, if not, and if nobody else than the assessors themselves who are going to charge a fee to do an alternatives assessment. And how are those fees going to be structured? Is there going to be a lot of variation in those fees? Are there going to be undercutting? I mean, yes, the market's great, but the market can also do perverse things. So I'm worried about that. Second thing I would think about is the exam for certification should be a common exam, which the department works with the accrediting bodies to develop, so that everybody is being examined to meet the same qualifications. And we use a narrative exam in Massachusetts, which kind of creates case study problems that an assessor would have to face as a way to see whether they get not only the kind of words of the law, but also get the spirit of it, how they actually would perform in making an alternatives assessment. I think that there should be some kind of, now this doesn't have to be in the regs, but I would hope there would be a conference, an annual conference of assessors or accrediting bodies and assessors, such there's a major place to meet and talk about what people are learning, and so that it really empowers both the assessors themselves, but also the department in its knowledge about what's going on. I think those are some of my thoughts about it, and I think this could work, but I think it needs to be tightened in its way. So those are my thoughts.
Very good. Thank you, Ken. Mike?
Thank you, Chair. I had a number of similar concerns around professional accountability and educational standards and certification and licensing, if you will. And it's similar in ways to industrial hygiene and safety engineering education that has now developed a field of professional practice that, as Ken is saying, includes a standard body of knowledge that everyone understands is part of that professional field. So I have a point, and then but first I have a question for you, Ken. For the 230 toxic use reduction planners, who do they work for? Once they've completed the program, are they part of the companies? So companies send them to the educational program?
Originally, there were two kinds. There were so-called in-house and out-of-house.
Mm-hmm.
In-house were in the companies. They did not have to go through the same training. Today, many companies send their in-house people to it, so it's a little hard to describe exact. Some are in-house, some are private consultants.
But then the state of Massachusetts issues the certification.
Yes.
Okay, great. So one of the things that we're involved with your sister agency, the Labor and Employment Agency, is a process that California went through during the latter half of the Schwarzenegger administration, where they essentially contracted out the process of training contractors for public works projects. And so there are tens of thousands of public works projects across the state that are, that occur within school districts and fire districts and all the state and local agencies and so forth. And every contractor that is required that wants to bid on that project needs to understand a large body of labor law, Cal OSHA regulations, wage and hour issues and so forth that sometimes can be unique to those districts and everything else. It's a fairly extensive training program that these contractors need to go through. That process was privatized and externalized, if you will, by the Schwarzenegger administration, and in part because the Department of Industrial Relations was overwhelmed with the training needs, and they recognized that their ability to communicate effectively to these contractors was not up to standard. They essentially had a checklist that the contractors certified that they understood all Cal OSHA regulations and so forth. And they wanted to increase their capacity to do that. The DIR did. And it turned out that that process lacked accountability. It lacked transparency. The department didn't have the ability to track the quality of the training across the state by multiple kinds of contractors, and now, just a month and a half ago, the Brown administration signed a new piece of legislation that returns all of that work back to the Department of Industrial Relations. And now DIR is developing a standardized training program, and that then gets rolled out across the state that will go to what are called awarding bodies, who will be standardized, trained in a standardized way, and there's accountability and auditing and so forth. So everyone from Tulare County to Imperial County understands a similar body of knowledge. So and there's a standard training criteria and professional standards and so forth. So it's a useful lesson in something that we've been through over the last 8 years or so around something that's sort of similar. And so I guess my concern of this was very similar to Ken's around the accountability around professional standards, educational criteria, and continuing education, advancing the knowledge that this is an evolving field, and it's going to have new science that's useful, applicable every year. And we want to be able to communicate that to the assessors. So that, I think, is just an overall concern that those aspects need to be improved. And I share the concern around the fee structure issue that through the Center for Occupational and Environmental Health at UC Berkeley, we run continuing education courses for industrial hygienists and safety engineers and so forth, and we charge for those, to keep the operation running, and so it makes sense to me that this would be that the training can and should be a fee-based structure, and that in some form that could help support the program within DTSC. Thank you, Chair.
Certainly, go ahead.
So, Mike, do I hear you say that you are recommending that we do not use external bodies? I mean, I heard your fears, but, in the example that you gave, what would thinking about, because I didn't hear that recommendation from Ken, so I'm just curious.
Do you mean in the, you mean external bodies who would be sort of assessors? Yeah. Because that's there's, anyway. No, I think it makes sense to, you mean to external being members within companies who would become trained in alternative assessment.
I'm sorry. It sounds like by your example that you feel like it's a fatal flaw perhaps to contract out the accrediting body concept, that it really should be within DTSC and that the fees should then all come to DTSC rather than contracting out the accrediting body function.
I see. I didn't quite state that. I don't think it makes sense for DTSC to try to mount this entire training program and train DTSC staff to do alternatives assessments across the state of California with all these businesses. That doesn't make sense, I don't think. What my example with Department of Industrial Relations was, they set the standards for training. They provided the vehicle for accountability and professional standards. They train the trainers, and they contract out for training of trainers, and those trainers adhere to a set of standards that everyone recognizes, and are professional criteria if you want to work with the state of California on public works projects. You can go through this training, and you can take on that responsibility. But it's much more accountable, and there are professional standards and guidelines and curricula, actually.
Very good. Thank you, Mike. Julia, and then I have Meg and Bob.
I agree with much of that Ken and Mike said. I think the uneven part of all programs like this is the training, and then even if you have a robust certification program, it will be uneven in terms of what comes out the other end. So in other words, the AAs performed by the certified assessors, even after they've been examined and passed the exam, it's going to be uneven. It's just the way it is. I would like to see more emphasis placed, and part of this is a clarification question. There is a review by DTSC of the AAs from the front end. You know, it's the report, and you're monitoring the AAs. Am I correct in that? That's written in. I don't know how. Odette? Oh,
I
were you
couldn't
going
tell if you wanted a response or not.
Well, yeah, please,
Okay.
because that's going to be predicated on what I say later.
So I don't know about from the front end. We will be looking at the report, the preliminary report, the
Right.
final report for, you know, consistency with the regulation, and we will be doing back-end audits. I think we'll be in the audits where we will do a much deeper dive than we will in the reports themselves.
Okay, because that was my point of confusion, because I think the hard part about alternatives assessment, the weak link in all of this, is the amount of expert judgment you have to do in terms of the assessment of the toxicological, you know, the data. There's scarce data involved, and, you know, the data are not particularly good for a lot of chemicals. It's missing. And there's a lot of expert judgment involved in whether or not you deem something, you know, safe or not safe, you know, regardless of the evidence criteria that are in the hazard traits regulation. So I think, you know, if DTSC is going to put resources, if there are resources to be had or found anywhere, I think it would be wonderful to have some assistance, because you will be looking at all of these AAs, and for products, there will be AAs on, you know, the same products by different companies. And, you know, waiting until people have gone through all of this work, as Ken said, it's going to be very disappointing when they put their best effort forward. They've trained assessors and they're certified in all of that. And then, you know, because of the weakness of the science and, you know, because it's just the way toxicology is. We don't have a lot of answers. We don't have a robust data on all of these things. I think it would be much better to start flagging things at the front end rather than the back end. Even when you do audits. I mean, it will make everything, and DTSC will learn from this process. You'll learn the difficulties with, you know, alternatives assessment from all of these various, on different products made by different people and how people do them differently. So, you know, if by some magic wand we could have resources, in addition to the accredited bodies and all of that, I would try to get some assistance with you know, looking at things as they come in, both the preliminary and the final report, and catch inadequacies there.
Thank you, Julia. Meg?
Thanks. Good morning. I have heard a lot of things that are really that I would generally just completely agree with, and it's helped me realign how I'm seeing this. And so I can just say in general I agree with what I've heard from Ken and Mike and Julia, which makes me think about a resource that the state of California has already that I think meets all these requirements, which is the UC Extension program. And for example, so UC Extension has very much the structure that we're calling for in the accreditation bodies, not as the assessors, but as accreditors. So they're used to developing professional education programs, certification programs. They're connected to campus. So several people in this room sit on the advisory committee to UC Extension in developing the curriculum for their green chemistry certificate, which they've been developing over the last few years. So they have access to professors and researchers on campus for developing curriculum, but then they have the structure and the experience with providing the professional education and granting certificates and all of that, and they have a fee structure, and I can easily see how that could be. I think the suggestions are excellent, that some of those fees obviously support, which is the UC Extension model, supports the development of the curriculum and the offering of it, but that maybe that also goes back some to DTSC to help fund the ongoing evaluation of the accreditors and potentially the auditing of the assessments. So that seems to me one vehicle for how to accomplish this in the state, and is through the UC Extension program or the whole infrastructure. And then there's two things about that. One is that there was something that I saw that was really excellent in here that was clarifying that the accrediting body should have no economic interest in the outcome or who gets certified as an assessor or all of that. So I think that's accomplished by using UC Extension. And I have no financial stake in UC Extension. They don't employ me. I volunteer my time on their advisory board. And the other thing is, I then think about the next stage of implementation, which is designing the training and the accreditation program, and that's what Julia brought up issues about. And I can see a natural connection between the design of the curriculum and the AA guidelines that the department is going to create. So the department thinks about, will be in developing the guidelines or the guidance documents, the AAs they want to see. And then from there, the guidance documents that will create the kinds of AAs that you need. And from there, we work backward to the accreditation curriculum and exams and that kind of thing. And I like Ken's idea of an annual CE, and that's all consistent with the kinds of programs that UC Extension already runs. I'm not just talking UC Berkeley, but UC Extension statewide. I also wanted to make one comment in the description of the qualifications of accreditation bodies in the regulation, which is page 60 of the current version. And that is, the very first section there says that the accreditation body needs to have on staff one or more individuals that possess all of the following. So all of the following is a good list. But coming from the medical profession, I can say that there are some situations, for example, in overseeing nurse practitioners, there has to be a physician who ultimately is accountable for everything that a nurse practitioner does. And so the presence of including every prescription written and every treatment given or not given, and I have at times served in that function, and I've at times turned that function down because I felt like I didn't have enough. There was going to be too much independent operation, and I didn't want to be responsible for all of the prescriptions written by the nurse practitioners in that organization. So I don't think it's enough to say there must be one person on the payroll of this organization that has these qualifications. There also has to be a structure for involvement of that person and their expertise in the actual functioning of the organization.
Thank you, Meg. Bob?
Thank you, Chair. First, I want to speak to the question, and in general, start by saying, yes, I think this is a good place to start. I think a lot of very complex issues, concepts, ideas, and challenges have been distilled into a reasonable roadmap to get this process off the ground. I think you'll learn as you go. A few questions and comments along the way. First, in the introduction to the question, the posting of non-redacted portions is mentioned. Do you have established guidelines for what and how you go about redacting information to guide that process?
Yes, we do. We have both the substantive rules that come out of the California's adopted the Uniform Trade Secrets Act, so there's this whole body of law that's grown up around what may be claimed as a trade secret. And in addition, we've set up some what I would just call modest housekeeping rules for how one claims the trade secret protection, such as prominently marking each page on which the provision is claimed to come under the privilege, et cetera. The trade secret article itself in these proposed regs, you'll see, runs a whopping total of 3 to 4 pages. So, and one of those pages has to do with how one justifies the claim, the level of evidence or facts that are required to show that, in fact, the material has been treated as though it is distinct from everyday business information.
Okay, thank you on that. And I guess just from a philosophical point of view, I think part of this exercise is to raise the bar. So we need to challenge ourselves to think about how we can provide more transparency in the process while still respecting the legitimate claims for CBI. And I think it's been mentioned by this committee on numerous occasions, modern analytical technology makes it possible to pretty much figure out anything and everything that's in anything in a relatively short period of time. So some of those claims are based on past precedents that probably wouldn't stand the test of good science today. So let me move on and ask you also a clarifying question here on, let's see, let me get to the right spot here. I'm looking at page 7 of the summary document, 7 of 16. Where the third bullet says the second bullet says dispersed as an aerosol or vapor. And my question is simply, is this meant to include, since it speaks to formulated products, the concept of spray cleaners for surfaces, kitchens, commercial food prep surfaces, and that? Because you have a separate bullet number 3 that applies to hard surfaces with the likelihood of runoff and or volatilization, which to me is an outdoor application consideration.
I'd have to think about that, and maybe there's some overlap in those two.
Okay. Well, so my only suggestion would be that if there's any confusion, to help minimize it, you may want to include something about surfaces in the second bullet. Okay? Let's see. I wanted to go back to some of the discussions about the AA accreditation. First of all, I think some of the things that Ken outlined, and I think that Michael built on, are very positive. This old idea of TERP, sorry to use that name because I don't remember the new one, I think is a reasonably good one, and probably the nomenclature needs to get changed a little bit. I want to bring up in the context of that certification process and the submission of data a thought that I offered a couple meetings ago, and that is, at the end of the day, when these things are submitted for review, I think it makes a lot of sense to have an officer of the company sign the document. That adds an element of review, expectation that things have been done thoroughly, completely, and consistent with the spirit of the regulation that we're trying to implement here. One more comment, and that is on on page 6 of the attachment 2 in the summary notes that you provided. It talks about availability information and that is necessary to substantiate the potential adverse impacts and exposures. And it's been referred to many times, but what is the consideration for how to handle a lack of information, which in my mind is probably going to represent the majority of the cases in many of these chemicals of concern. And to simply say there's no information, therefore there's no basis for a judgment, is probably not acceptable in the spirit of what we're trying to do here going forward. I believe I read that one of the regulatory responses is to request additional information. And with a request like that, I think there needs to be consideration of who and how that gets funded, and the answer to that is probably fairly obvious, and also how long it takes to generate that kind of information, because some of these studies can be rather long-term, and what does that do to the timing of the cycle for the alternatives assessment that's taking place. And, Mr. Chair, I'll stop at that point.
Thank you, Bob. I have Jay and Todd, and I'll take a turn at that point, and then Kelly.
Thank you, Chair. I have a couple of comments and suggestions I'd like to make. I think Mike and also Ken about this, Ken's idea about the limited accredited body versus external and internal sourcing. Having a limited body, accredited body, I think is one of the best way to prevent the so-called the concern that Mike expressed from the former administration. Because I like to take some examples of like the state of Indiana or the city of Indianapolis. They've been doing this external not only auditing, but also even nowadays highway infrastructure is really outsourcing rather than, sponsoring by federal government and or state government. So there is examples of how successfully run this kind of credit body. So I like to consider DTSC should have some control of limiting the number of credit bodies. In doing so, I think we can increase the transparency as well as efficiencies of controlling the credit bodies. Second comment I have is some concern of Ken made remarks in terms of so-called surprising effect from the party of applicants or the companies without updating the status of progress of their assessment of the concern of chemicals in their product or formulations. I'm not sure what the DTSC is considering in terms of this website utilization. Is that we, as a private company, we did a lot of custom escalation, for example, and one of the most complaint from customer point of view is that we as a company, if we don't update them, the progress of their escalated issues, problems, although they do not expect, we deliver the solutions, every issue and the complaint they brought us. But important thing is really update the customer, the status, so that where they are really stand, their applications. So when you design the website, probably include so-called a onboarding or updating checklist. Very short. It doesn't have to be, because you are structured very well, the way that I read. But it does so that automate the update information goes out to their particular customer, in this case, applicant. And you can update it. You don't have to wait 180 days or 12 months or whatever, but at least automated a message going out saying, okay, where you stand, so that they know or they do not have a surprise when DTSC finally deliver the approval status. So that's my comment.
Thank you, Jay. Todd?
Thank you, Chair. I'm just reading the first line in terms of the qualification and certification of assessors, and I've been really driven to the couple of words where it says an individual in responsible charge of conducting, which when you look at all of the requirements for that individual, we know that no single individual as an assessor is going to be able to do the alternatives assessment for anything other than a very, very simple product. This, following on from this, reminds me very much of, I have a professional engineering license that I have in a number of states, and it reminds me very much of that because I am the principal responsible person in charge, although I have a team of individuals that work under me. And on that basis, I would really like to see just one accreditation body to make sure that you would have a consistency across all of these things. The other thing, though, that I think you have to do is in 2A there, have an equivalent of 4 years of professional experience. That is not sufficient for a management individual to run a AA. It's just not enough time for an individual to be in a management level to know what they don't know, so that they have the right people on their staff. And so, other than that, from a broad thing, if I look at it as being almost like a PE, and when you read this, that's the way it comes out, that you really need only one accreditation thing, but you're also going to need to have something in there with management experience, and you're going to have something in there that's larger in terms of time for that individual that's in charge. Thank you, Chair.
Thank you, Todd. I've put myself on the list at this point, and I wanted to make a couple of points, particularly going to the idea of conflict of interest, which is expressed in the reg as a financial conflict. And if you go back and look at the definitions, the bar for financial conflict is extraordinarily low as $2,000. That's hardly workable in these days. The way it's written, it appears to me that any organization that in fact ever did business with a company that manufactures a chemical of concern might be disallowed from being a certifying organization, which would leave out a number of consulting firms that in fact have this kind of expertise. And so what I would say is what you're really trying to get at, if you use this, is not just financial conflict, but conflict of interest. And there are other conflicts other than financial. So, for example, would you also disallow organizations that are advocacy organizations that have advocated about particular chemicals over the course of time? I would argue that presents the same kind of conflict as a nominal $2,000 investment in a company presents. So what I'm really coming to is I think the conflict of interest part of this is unnecessary. That if you found either one or many potential certifiers, that there are far better ways of determining whether they are qualified to train people to do this work, not do the work themselves necessarily, but qualified to train people to do the work. And I think that part of it, understanding the point of view, that conflict might be more important in the lead assessor, but certainly not, from my perspective, in the trainer. And I want to take one step downstream. I disagree with Ken in that I think there will be relatively few of these early on because of the uncertainty associated with it. My belief, and it's only a belief at this point because at this point we're speculating, but my belief is you'll see relatively few of these except for people who have no choice. And as a result, I suspect that they will trickle in rather than to be a deluge. And the reason for that is I think people would much rather do things that they can control and have more certainty over. And frankly, the AA process appears to have a lot of uncertainty associated with it. Because of its nature, because you're doing something new, and despite the analogies, and I'm compelled by what Todd said about the analogies to a PE, I think you ought to take a 20-year view of this process and have a bit of launch and learn associated with it, to recognize that you're going to be seeing some of these trickle in. You're going to see if you're getting what you want, and you will be able, because it's in a regulation, if you design it correctly, I believe, you will be able to modify what you want and what you get over the course of time as you see the way this is evolving. There is a bit of flexibility that's been written into this anyway, where you may have alternative approaches to what's been suggested, and that's good. But judging how those alternatives, whether those alternatives are to the point or not, is also going to require some experience, and you're not going to be able to tell people exactly the right way to do that. So, I guess if this were mine to do unilaterally, the approach that I might take would be either to have one training organization, as Todd suggests, or not worry about it and allow organizations that do this to hang out their shingle and train, and make the state's choke point at a certification exam for an individual assessor in much the same way as there is a PE exam. And from there, decide after 3 to 5 years whether you're seeing what you need, if you're getting what you want, if there is a further modification that's required, if CE courses are developing along the way to feed this ecosystem that you're creating. I think it would be a mistake to try to have this perfect on day one, and I think this is one that truly lends itself to evolving over a 10 to 20 year time period to get it where you want. Thank you very much. Let's see, where are we? Kelly, I have you, and then I'm going to take Tim Joe and Art, because they haven't spoken yet, Mike, before I get back at Ann. I'm going to hold you for a second intervention, Mike, if that's okay. Go ahead, Kelly.
Thank you, Chair. I'm looking to the department's questions again. Given DTSC's limited resources, is the approach sufficient to provide meaningful QA, and what steps could we take? And I think in general, the department is trying to do the best it can within its resource structure here, and so the general approach here does make sense to me. I really appreciate Ken's comments, I guess, in the Ken. And sort of where all that falls. Ken versus Bill, I guess I'm more in the Ken camp in that I've watched a lot of people go through the PE exam process, and people are taking huge amounts of time off work. They're doing all these things. It's very disruptive, and I'm not sure that we're ready to go to that high of a bar right away on a new kind of program. So I can see that strategy, but I'm thinking that this is going to be largely development. It's a professional development force. That's really what we're going to need to do for the first decade. And in that sense, I think we need to build a cadre of professionals. And I think we do that better by having one or a couple of organizations that are dedicated to doing that than we do by saying it's a free-for-all, figure it out. And if we do it's a free-for-all, then the state has to figure out who's certifying which trainings and all the rest, and it still is a mess. So I guess I tend to fall more towards the Ken model. But I think that it's not impossible that someday it would move more towards the PE model that Bill described, so it's not all there. Also, I agree with the requirement for the officer signature. It's been my professional experience that that's been very important. In my work in local government, that was exceptionally important in making sure the right level of attention was paid and the right company commitment was provided. And I also agree, I'm not sure who made this comment, but about how much experience a lead assessor needs. I would really think that the person who's actually running the project might need 10 years of experience. You could take away some of that for advanced education. But this is a complicated thing. It covers a lot of areas, and it's not something that somebody with a few years out of school is going to be able to be the boss of, as opposed to on the team for. And then finally, actually back to the assessor qualification, one more reaction, which is that I think that it's going to be really important that people trust the qualifying organization, and that's something we're kind of all dancing around here. And that's not just industry trusting it, it's also the environmental community and others trusting it. The state is going to have the ability to say it's okay or not, so they'll need to trust it. And that's why I think conflict of interest is important. So I agreed with all of the first parts that Bill raised about what is a conflict of interest. But again, I fall on the need to make sure that we have an organization that feels as independent as possible. And that is a little complicated, because when I started reading this, I was thinking about, well, who serves on the board? And you don't want any advocacy organization to have that role of certifying assessors. That would just be totally inappropriate. So I don't know exactly how we write that in and what models there exist in the law to make sure that DTSC has the ability to select organizations that are really going to be trustworthy from all different viewpoints. Because that's, I think, what we're looking for. So, and back to just the main thing, I think that the place where I'm really stuck on this is the fact that DTSC doesn't have enough budget to really do a robust plan review and auditing program, and that's why the previous versions had that third-party review. And I understand the basis here. I'm not supportive of the basis of the approach the department's taking now, based on what I've heard in terms of the feedback on that. But what worries me about it is that that's because the department doesn't have a lot of resources, we wind up with not having a level playing field among folks who are doing these, that those who are doing a better quality one versus those who might be doing a more sucky one, they might get away with it to some extent because the department just isn't going to have the resources to go through and do everything. So here again is another example where if the department had a little more resources, since we're falling on the side of we really want the department to be doing those QA reviews, and we're not wanting to privatize that function. We've decided we want to have the department do that. The business interest may be to actually make sure the department has enough funding to do these properly so that there's a level playing field. Because otherwise, I think it could end up favoring those people who aren't doing the quality job, and that would not be in the interests of the businesses who are competing with them. And then finally, this is a smaller point, but I've had some troublesome experience with it, which is the work plan piece of the preliminary AA. When that comes in, that is largely, it's a selection of alternatives largely in a work plan. And I've seen in the pesticide world, this does not work so well. So the pesticide regulators commonly require work plans out of pesticide manufacturers, and you see really talented people who are really smart giving really schlocky work plans to DPR, and then DPR has to spend its staff time telling the companies what to do. And I'm still trying to figure out exactly what creates that dynamic. You know, having spoken with the scientists who are submitting these plans, I know they're fully capable of submitting very high-quality documents, and it is a bit mystifying to me why they don't. There seems to be an advantage in playing the process out that the pesticide regulators have to tell them what to do. So they're perceiving that as an advantage. So I caution that in the structure, I think you've done a nice job with the time frames to make it disadvantageous to do that, but to think about, are there other things you could do to advantage those people who do a good quality document and turn it in? And the only idea I have from right now to suggest to you is that that the assessors could be reported for putting in, so that there could be some form of, when DTSC reviews something and sees that either the preliminary or final AA is not of acceptable quality, that there should be a function for DTSC to be reporting that to the certification organization, and that there be follow-up on that end as well as with the company that submitted it. So thank you.
Thank you. I have Tim, Joe, Art, and Ann, and then I'll go to second round interventions. Tim, it's yours. Oh, I'm sorry, Dale. It's new. I'm sorry.
Thank you. Would it be all right to ask a clarifying question?
Absolutely.
Before giving my comment?
Certainly, go right ahead.
Because, and this comes up in this conversation about, I guess some of us, I think, maybe have different perceptions of what the facts will be once this program rolls out. So I had a question in terms of whether DTSC has a sense of, number one, exactly how many staff or resources would be available for AA review and then also auditing. And then secondly, how many AAs, assuming you do the 2 to 4 product approach, how many AAs are you thinking you might see? Because we're all making certain assumptions, and the answers to those questions, I think, are relevant to how useful this process would be.
Okay, in terms of your first question about number of staff, I don't think we really have a number right now. That's something we're working on, and part of how we work on that is through our annual budget process. And in terms of number of alternatives assessments, I don't have a number for you, and I think that will depend significantly on the particular product chemical combinations that we pick. You know, the range of manufacturers for a given product will vary with the particular product. But it's obviously something we're going to have to be thinking about in our planning.
Thank you.
Tim, do you have a statement?
I had some comments, and that helps me kind of formulate my comments.
Okay.
But if Ken wanted to interject.
I just wanted to add one clarification, and that is because the program, I think the way I remember it, there's a 180-day period between the identification of the product chemical and the time at which the preliminary is due. It isn't just the number, but it's the rate at which they come in. After 180 days, there's going to be, how many ever there are, they're all going to come in at once.
Thank you. Well, when you think about this question about the certified assessor and the audit authority, to me it depends on what you think you want from a program. And it seems to me there's 2 different ways one could characterize this program. One would be what I think of as a reflexive approach, that essentially what it's designed to do is get companies to think about these questions, to perform an analysis, and to act on that analysis, and that the regulatory framework is all there to provide some push and incentive to it, but the regulatory process is not really focused on the substantive outcome itself, right? And I got the sense that there's a little bit of a hybrid there because, you know, at the start of the meeting, I think Odette said, well, how Debbie describes it is we get the companies to ask the question, but we don't answer the question. The companies answer the question. But then we have our regulatory response. So it seems like you're looking for something more than a reflexive approach where you're just trying to get them to think, kind of like, I don't know if it'd be appropriate to say like the Massachusetts Turi approach is kind of like a reflexive approach, right? It sounds like we want something, and if this was a reflexive approach, I would say the way this is structured is probably fine with some of the, many of the fine-tuning and additional comments that people had made. If what you're looking for is something more, and I take it that you are, the meaningfulness part, that there's going to be some oversight of that and some active push to ensure that safer alternatives are chosen when they're available, or that if they're not, that meaningful controls are going to be placed on the continued use of hazardous chemicals, then I'm really concerned about this approach, and not because of the regulations themselves, but because, I mean, it's like the emperor has no clothes. We're sitting around this room talking about a comprehensive program for which there is no information collection authority to speak of and no realistic funding available. And so this is outside the confines, and yet we kind of play around the edges of that. And I just wish there were an opportunity or a vehicle by which this panel could speak not only to DTSC but to the legislature and the administration more broadly. My sense is that when we say things that people outside this room like, that they'll kind of hitch on to that and send letters to people and say, you should do what the Green Ribbon Science Panel is saying. And I just wish, and maybe we can talk about this later today, that there were a vehicle by which we could address those folks more directly. And if there were a sense on the panel that there needs to be some additional authorities and some realistic funding for the program, that we can make that statement, and perhaps that would be listened to as well as some of the other things that we've said. But we live in the world we live in, and I know, Bill, I've got to address the question. So how can we try to make the second best solution work? And here's my concern about what's going on here is that we've seen programs like this where it's essentially planning programs with an auditing function, and the one I'm most familiar with is facility planning and stormwater pollution prevention planning. And when I was in practice and when I did work with the clinic at UCLA, one of the areas that we knew we were going to find lots of problems with was stormwater pollution prevention planning, which had plenty of guidance documents and lots of trained people to do those plans. And then when you went and looked at them, they were pretty, many of them were quite deficient. But the agencies really didn't have enough personnel to review them, and unless somebody kind of highlighted that and brought citizen suits actions, oftentimes things generally didn't happen. There's exceptions to that. So, and I'm really worried that that's what's going to happen to this program. So I think maybe a way to help that, given the constraints that we have, is with the, I think all the suggestions, particularly the ones Ken made about the assessors, I completely agree with. I think focusing on the audit program a bit, I think it is unclear to me whether the audit program is designed to engage in substantive review of decisions that have been made or simply another process review. And the reason I'm confused has to do with the regulatory language itself. So let me make some specific suggestions about how, assuming that it's supposed to be a substantive review, that's my assumption, some suggestions I would make about making that clear. If you go look at page 41 of the regulations, that lays out the standards that have to be met in the second stage of the alternatives assessment. And by the way, I'm kind of curious why we call it alternatives assessment. The statute calls it alternatives analysis. But step 2 is, it talks about evaluating, comparing, priority. Well, there's actually some substance to that because I think alternatives assessment actually has some connotations with it and some history, and tends to stop at the kind of the performance matrix part of it. Doesn't really engage in the evaluative aspects that's so unique here. So I think it might make some sense to stop using the older term and to kind of brand this with the new term that's in the statute. Okay, so step 2 talks about evaluate or compare priority product. Step 3 says responsible entities select the alternative that will replace or modify the priority product. If you want to have an auditing program that is substantive, I think there has to be some integration into these provisions of some substantive standards against which the evaluation will be done and the selection will be done. And I will put my money where my mouth is, and I've said this a lot of times and have never actually come up with any. I understand that. So I'm going to try and come up with some examples of what I have in mind and send it to you. I think other folks, if they're interested in this, should also be thinking in those same ways. The other suggestion I have is actually in the audit provisions themselves that appear on page 65 to clarify whether this provides the department with the authority to not only review but to require changes or to come to a different conclusion. Right now it says you can audit compliance with Article 5 requirements. Right now the Article 5 requirements are all process requirements, mostly, not all, but mostly. But then number 2 says you can audit information quality and adequacy of analysis, and that to me seems to suggest you're going to get to the substance. If that's what you're trying to get to, in addition to adding substantive standards that you could assess against, I would also make it clear here that that's what is intended in the audit. The other specific suggestion I have is that in your authority for review of preliminary AAs and final AAs, that you also use that language of is there a deficiency with compliance? And that to me reads kind of like completeness determination or process determination. And if you want to have the substantive ability to require changes or to come to a different conclusion, I think it either ought to be in that particular provision or it ought to be more expressed in the regulatory response, because the way regulatory response is written right now, in a sense, it puts us right where we are currently, where it's written as if you can ban certain products if you feel it's necessary, regardless of what's in the AA. That's how I read it. But it doesn't give you the authority to any way encourage the adoption of a safer alternative. So if you thought there was a safer alternative, maybe even one that was identified in the AA, that was rejected by the other party, it seems to me you have the authority to ban the product the way these regs are written, to maybe put the person on the non-compliance list, depending on how you write the standards, require engineering controls for the existing product. But I don't see any authority the way this is written to actually, in any way, either directly by requiring adoption, maybe that's too strong, or indirectly the way EPA SNAP program for ozone-depleting chemicals is set up, where you have a separate authority where you can approve acceptable substitutes. So that would be different, right? So one is require people to adopt a different alternative, which may be too strong a authority for lots of different reasons for some folks, or to say we're going to ban this product and we have a process in line where folks can come and get approval for a substitute for that product. And I think there's lots of experience in the SNAP program as to how that would function and might work. And it's a way, I think, of achieving the statutory goal, which is to not have simply product bans with, kind of a Wild West free-for-all after that could lead to regrettable substitution, but rather an affirmative attempt to guide the marketplace towards safer alternatives. Thank you.
Thank you, Tim. Let's sort of review the bidding of where we are here. I have, for first interventions, and I think this is correct, I have Joe, Art, Ann, and Dale. I have Mike and Meg who would like a second opportunity to speak, and we have approximately 25 minutes remaining in this session. We're going to have to be pretty good about time because there are planes for various people. So taking all that into mind, Joe, the floor is yours.
I'll only take 20 minutes here. Okay, I want to just make a brief remark on the transparency issue. You've asked a question of whether AAs should be, redacted AAs should be put on your website, made publicly available. Ken raised an interesting, countervailing, I think you should. I would advocate that you should do that. Ken suggested that, making these things public might restrict, the depth of analysis that people do because there's going to be scrutiny of it. And so there's there are clearly places where you want to create privileges and, protect analyses from disclosure to get, more honest analysis. But I don't really think this is a good situation for that. I mean, I think this program for lots of reasons, but maybe most importantly, because DTSC just has such limited resources, that I just think that public transparency is very important here, particularly if we want to think about these as providing a sentinel kind of function. I mean, if the market doesn't really know what's happening, it's not going to work as a sentinel to communicate, to the market and influence the market. So I really think that I would advocate that AA should be made public. They're going to have to be redacted. We need to see that situation. If you don't put them on their website, interest groups are going to request them through a FOIA, and they're going to get them, and then they'll put them out there, but it won't be as authoritative a disclosure as if it's just on DTSC's website. I think it's a real issue here, how the trade secrets is going to work, and that the public disclosure of those AAs needs to be done so we can see how that's working. And then one other aspect of that I want to highlight is the assessors can develop, this is on page 38 of the regulations, their own AA process that differs from the one that DTSC develops. I think companies are developing their own processes now. Some have implemented. I think they look at them as actual, business assets that they developed. I've heard people are even patenting those things as business methods. So I guess it's possible to imagine that the AA process that's used itself would be claimed as a trade secret and not disclosed. I think that would be very hard to stomach, if we have an AA process that comes out, and not only are the chemicals and the products and the alternatives that are selected or not selected, if all of that is trade secret, so it's very hard to penetrate, but even the process that's used to do the evaluation is a trade secret, So I guess I want to suggest the possibility of saying that an alternative process can be used, but it can't be claimed as trade secret. It can only be used if you're going to disclose that so that it can be, at least the process can be evaluated.
Thank you, Joe. Art?
Thank you, Chair. Just want to touch back on the accreditation body, especially the comments that Meg made about, excuse me, perhaps using the UC extension. I think that's an excellent idea. However, I do have some concerns in that I think UC extension's just excellent on the educational function part of it, but I'm not sure that UC extension would want to get into the administrative and accounting function of certification, where they would have to maintain keep track of people's continuing education. So perhaps as an alternative and to jumpstart the process is to have DTSC actually considering forming some kind of agreement or understanding with an existing established professional organization. And I don't know what a good one is, but perhaps something like AIHA, American Industrial Hygiene Association, something similar to that, but it's product safety specific. That way, they would already have the infrastructure and the mechanisms in place in terms of training, testing, and maintenance of certification. Just as a suggestion. Thank you.
Thank you, Art. Ann?
Thank you, Art, for bringing UC Extension back into this, and Meg beat me to it, so thank you for the plug for Extension. I have, in addition to being on the advisory board for the Green Chemistry Certificate Program, I've also developed curricula and continuing to develop curricula and be an instructor in that program. Art, I think they do actually have that ability to track training, and they do track that for several certificate programs. I'd have to double check it, but I think your example of an existing professional organization would also be another option. Also, I'm going to implementation again and thinking about examples that we can look at in the more immediate term of how to go about authorizing accreditation bodies both to do alternatives assessments and training the trainers. And since Lauren is not here, imagine me with blonde curly hair for a moment, and I will channel her. Green Screen is currently doing this, or is in the throes of doing that, and that would be an interesting thing to look at. They are both certifying external bodies to perform green screen alternatives assessments. I realize that's a sort of a smaller version of what we're looking at here. And also thinking about how to train trainers within green screen. So that's a very immediate source of information on this committee itself that you could look at. I would also look at perhaps the Design for Environment Alternatives Assessment Program and how they're going about. I don't know about the training piece, but at least they are certifying third parties. But I hadn't thought all the way through, but I think green screen may be a better, closer option.
Dale? I'm sorry?
That was Lauren.
Oh, I'm sorry. Thank you, Lauren.
Yeah.
Your hair looks marvelous.
Yeah. So kind of
now, Dale.
Thank you very much, and I'll keep my hair the way it is. So as I was looking at this and then listening to everybody else, I think what comes out is that the bones of this will work, and it's in the details of everything of how you actually get there, and to me, what this is setting up over time is a self-policing type of process. That's what you're hoping it sets up, that there's a new philosophy that's taking place within industry or whatever it happens to be, but it's self-policing, and then there's checks and balances along the way so that at least you hope to get to the old 80-20 rule, that 80% of the stuff comes out correct and 20% may not be. And that's always, that's kind of the standard that's used for that. Now, there's a couple of interesting things in terms of certification programs. One, there's certification to create credentials, and then there's certification to create a license to do something. And those are two different things. So if I sit, here I am, a board-certified toxicologist, that's a credentialing type of thing. But it's what I do in relationship to that internationally that maybe makes me acceptable as an expert in certain areas. But then there's a licensing part that allows you to do something. I'm a licensed pharmacist, and to do that, I have to maintain, I don't do that, but in fact, that'd be dangerous if I tried to do that. But there's, you have to learn how to spell drugs or something. And pardon me? Which the over and over again is the problem. So we have to be careful in terms of what we're dealing with certification. Is it a credentialing type of thing, or is it a license to do something? And the critical thing here to me is that when you put in an audit part in DTSC, then the auditor has to be credentialed or licensed in the same way that the people that are doing it. If you don't, you do not have the appropriate audit that's actually acceptable. And so that's something you have to be extremely aware of. But to go back, I think that the aspects of this, as it's written, will work, and it's the details that's going to make it happen. And I kind of agree with the idea that this will take place over time. There's got to be some flexibility in it. You're going to learn a lot, but you can't write it so that it's just so overly restrictive on the front end. Now, when you get in, and I want to mention something about conflict of interest, because this is something that is just inherent in the whole process. Everybody, and this includes me, everybody who works for a company gets into the product defense mode, and you tend to get into that within the first 2 months of coming into a company. So it doesn't matter what your field is, you're in a product defense mode. And you could view that as a conflict of interest, but it is, in fact, the way it is within, and it has to be. Why would you hire somebody into a company that isn't, supporting the products and everything else? And so the whole idea of conflicts is just inherent in this whole thing. And that's why I agree with Bill that I think you have to just end the whole idea of conflicts of interest, because it's just there. It's always been there. You have to deal with that in a self-policing aspect, and you hope that it comes out to the 80-20 rule. So I think to summarize then, if I can count to 5, to summarize, I think this will work, and it's a matter of just working out the details.
Thank you, Dale. I have Roger, and I want just a short process check. Julie, Rich, and Bruce, you have not asked for the floor Not interested?
Interested but not
I'm sorry? All right, I'll put you on the list. Thank you, Bruce. Roger, it's yours.
Thank you, Chair. I'll go quickly here. The first thing is the conflict of interest. I think at the very least, the conflict of interest should be disclosed. So if the assessor has a conflict of interest, so no matter how you might go, it needs to be disclosed. So there is a portion where I think you're going to disclose the assessor's name as part of this, I believe. Maybe any conflicts of interest associated with that assessor might be kind of a middle point to get away from this economic piece, because I don't know how you deal with that one. Secondly, Bob's idea of senior leader sign-off, I kind of like that idea, but I might suggest one addition, and that would be liability insurance, some kind of a, for instance, professional liability insurance is a normal thing for a professional, and maybe to require that to be in place for your protection. Ken, I like your idea of the portion of the fee going to the DTSC, though I don't know how that works regulatory. I don't know if you can even accept it. I don't know how you go about it, but I like that idea. And then Ann's idea of the green screen, I think, really makes a lot of sense, because that's a process that businesses are using today to incorporate into their kind of AA thinking. And so trying to attach to something that's already being embraced in business might be a good thing. Thank you, Chair.
Thank you, Roger. Bruce? Microphone,
this is
please.
a how do you protect innovation question. In the publication of the, let's say, the redacted form, I assume that that the alternative will be named. Here's the problem. 5 companies show up as having a chemical of concern and a product of concern in your first round. Company A comes up with a solution through investment and innovation. They come up with an answer. The other 4 don't. How do you protect the information developed by Company A? It's still a free market system. I mean, we still have to be, I mean, that company should be rewarded for.
So the way it would work is the company, if Company A believes that the alternative they've come up with is in fact subject to trade secret protection, they make that claim when they submit the AA.
Okay.
The department independently reviews and sees if it concurs with that determination, and that's how it would play out. So it's neither it's neither de facto in or out as a category of information from being trade secret. The only thing that's per se out is this hazard trade information. It's this odd provision in the statute. So parties are free to make the claim, and then we would review.
Okay.
Thank you, Bruce. Okay, Mike, it's yours.
Thank you, Bill. So, when I first read through this, I was really struck about how we have. This represents to me an extraordinary opportunity to build professional and technical capacity in California among a community of alternative assessors, who continually improve their practice and so forth. And I went through the industrial hygiene program at UC Berkeley, accredited by the American Board of Engineering and Technology, and that cadre of students. So I mean, I guess I'm getting the point here is, what does that capacity look like? What does it look like to build professional capacity? So that cohort of students to this day, 9-10 years later, continues to interact, and they're in different parts of the state, and they all face common problems around protecting workers and also understanding environmental exposures and engineering, and they talk to each other, and they get together once a year, and they develop a field of practice. And I guess this gets to Todd Delaney's point that what we're struggling with here in a way is that the world of alternatives assessment is not a there's not a lexicon, there's not a dogma in a way that we teach a certain body of knowledge and then you understand that and now you're certified. Bang. It's a field that's developing. It's rife with discovery and inquiry and the need for continual improvement. And so that's a model of professional education versus vocational education, if you will. And I think Todd's point about that, and it's actually, there's a place in the regulation where, you know, it stipulates the alternative chemical being considered in a number of ways, a number of places. But in fact, we all know it's much more complicated than that. There are alternative processes and so forth that involve not chemistry necessarily, but engineering, environmental engineering, finance, law issues, questions of relative risk, and so forth, that are sophisticated and they're complicated. And so I think it would be expedient in a way to move this field of practice into a private consulting arena. And I would just urge the department not to move in that direction, that the way we can develop, again, this is sort of Bill's point about developing having a 20-year vision of developing capacity in this developing field is, as others have said, driving this as much as we can into the existing educational system in California. And in my view of that, that includes the community colleges, the CSUs, the UC system, and the UC extension for that matter. But building, it's a building technical and professional capacity is a process that I think can and should be integrated across our existing educational system, and it sort of incorporates this process of teaching student innovation that grows out of that, professional practice, apprenticeship training of sorts, continuing education, and research. And students who come to this process and recognize there are fundamental research questions that we need to answer here as we're moving into new materials and so forth. That's long-term capacity. I guess it gets me back to Art Fong's original point about smart regulation and policy. How does it develop a spirit of inquiry and discovery and educational capacity in the state versus a checkbox, more sort of regulatory oversight. There's a spirit there that I think that's evoked here, and we're getting to in this regulation, and but we can do more. I think in invoking a sort of capacity building educational arena, and so that's again, it's sort of there's a level of sophistication and sort of cutting edge strategy that I think could be inoculated by this process by the regulations, and I guess and of course I'm happy to help with that as any way that I can, and we have a lot of experience in sort of struggling through this process at COEH. On the conflict of interest side, this is one way you avoid conflict of interest is to move this process into the state's educational infrastructure. And we did, one of the things I mentioned earlier around the training of contractors at public works projects, that was privatized previously and based in consulting firms, and they were not only conducting the training and training of trainers, but they were doing assessments and auditing. And ultimately, it was discovered that they were suffering from conflict of interest issues that diluted their credibility in a way, and sort of gets to Dale's point around this sort of product defense that there was an internal conflict of interest that was developing there that we finally discovered, but it took several years. And so I just want to encourage in any way that we can to move this into our existing educational system for all of those reasons.
Thank you, Mike.
Thank you.
Julie, I see your flag. You haven't spoken yet. I'm going to give preference to you, and then I'll touch the others. I would ask the second interventions to be brief, please. Julie?
Thank you, Chair. Mike, I love your optimism. I might be more of a skeptic. I just wanted to echo an experience that I have, and it reflects on Kelly's comment about why do the scientists not bother to write a really well-written plan when you know they could, and I think Tim touched on that as well in terms of how do we ensure quality of these AAs, and it would be lovely if it got into the academic arena and became something people were really proud of generating and providing to the state. But I think I would just was remembering a few years ago working with the folks here from DTSC and the pollution prevention group and the source reduction plans that need to get submitted, and how frustrated we all were with how poor the quality was. And if we could just even have a mechanism to go back and say, this isn't what we were looking for, can you actually tell us this, this, and this, they would have been much more useful. So I guess my suggestion is I'm not a regulatory writer. I don't know what the right language is, but maybe looking at examples of what didn't work or what doesn't provide a really high-quality report, such as in the pollution prevention, source reduction mandates, and in these other programs around the state. And try to find models where it does lead to quality reporting. I would just encourage some background on that if you have the opportunity to.
Thank you, Julie. I have 3 more requests for intervention, and I'm going to ask you to take no more than a minute, please. Meg?
Thanks. This is just specifically pertinent to the issues that have been raised. I'll save the other ones for the later section. One is to follow up on this conflict of interest issue. I think there's a real difference between the people who are doing the teaching in an accreditation program and the actual accrediting organization and the assessors. So there's 3 different bodies here that we're talking about, and I don't want to conflate them. The accrediting organization obviously needs to have no conflict of interest, as I believe the assessors. So, but what that means is no existing financial stake in the outcome of the alternatives assessment or in the way that people are trained to do it. And that doesn't mean an absence of experience in economic entities. So we want people with experience in industry to be involved in the process of how one assesses alternatives. But the outcome of an alternatives assessment should not advantage or disadvantage the person who performs the assessment. And I think that's a difference. So in extension, for example, Anne is a independent consultant who teaches in it. There are many people who have 30 years experience in industry who teach in extension, but extension itself doesn't have any economic interest or experience necessarily in any economic entity. The second issue that I want to raise hasn't been talked about yet, which is the issue of disputes. And there are provisions in the regulations that allow for disputes to be raised at any for any action that DTSC takes at any point in the process. And something that's in the summary, but I could not find in the regulation itself, probably my own problem, is on page 4 of the summary, which says that companies can dispute any action, which to me includes listing of a chemical of concern or listing of a priority designation of a priority product, and that action is stayed during the dispute. And so since our goal here is to get to alternatives assessment, and since many of the regulatory responses don't actually hinge on the outcome of an alternatives assessment, the idea that you can put on hold any level of action by the department during a dispute, to me, has ramifications for alternatives assessment and their validity and getting to them in the way that we're discussing here. So I just want to raise that issue.
Thank you, Meg. Ken?
Yeah, just quickly, just a response a bit to Mike's statement about the capturing of the learning that is taking place, because this is such an enormous opportunity to really explore this idea of an alternatives assessment and to build our collective knowledge and all of how to do this. I should have paraphrased my earlier statement by saying my learning originally arose out of, in 1983, when I worked on the passage of the Massachusetts Right to Know, Workers' Right to Know bill, and we made paid no attention to the market it was going to create for consultants to run in and sort of offer services to management about chemicals used in the production processes. And it was Tim mentioned a Wild West show. I mean, it was like there were huge abuses during that period. And I had never fully understood that a regulation often creates a market. So we had missed the whole notion there. So when we did the Tura program, I wanted to really capture that idea and really make that a part of our learning and allow that tremendous flowering of professionals to really be a part of the growth of the program. And so, yes, we actually, the toxic use reduction planners, we celebrated them and memorialized them and made them very much siblings of the program, to the extent that they created their own association, they had their own awards program. Today they are and the last piece is that they are a major constituent of the program, so that when the program needs support in the legislature or when the program needed to be updated, they were a very important part of the knowledge and all that came back to the program to really support it. The use of the university was also valuable, and I'm open here. I think Arts Right professional associations may be a good opportunity as well. But the university turned out to be terrific. It gave the program tremendous legitimacy because the university, as here, the California system, is well respected. So it gave it a kind of embodiment of authoritarian of kind of knowledge and all. But what it also did was it kicked into the normal parts of the university, such that within the University of Massachusetts, we began to offer courses that for credit for graduate students. And then in my case, actually we developed a accredited graduate program in this area, so that we were producing and we were getting planners coming back to school to get a degree to go out and do this. So it became a channel for much larger learning and much more feedback. So I just want to note that as well. Thank you.
Thank you, Ken. Kelly?
Extremely quick. We've had a lot of discussion about conflict of interest, and I just want to wrap up by saying I think the department correctly created different provisions for assessors and for the accreditation organization. Assessors will all have some level of conflict of interest because they will be paid by the company for whom they're doing the assessment. That is actually why it's so important that the accrediting organization be independent. And that's the word that I think is probably the most important word to think about. How do we embody independence in the regulations? And the goal of that is to ensure that it's trusted by all the different stakeholders, including the state itself. Thank you.
Thank you, Kelly. All right, that brings us to the end of this session, and thank you all very much. We have a break now, and I would ask you to be back here by 20 after, please, recognizing there's a little slop in this, so we'd like to kick off at 10:25, so please be back about 10:20, and then we'll have the final discussions. Thank you very much.